It is. Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about yourself and what you
Yes,
do.
thank you. Yeah. My name is Mark Hadley. I am um, the lead minister at Vancouver Church of Christ in Vancouver, Washington. So I'm a pastor, Christian pastor. I've been doing some version of ministry since 2001. I did youth ministry, worked with teenagers and families for about 14 years, and then started teaching and preaching more about 2014. And then, yeah, and I'm a lead pastor now at this church. Been here since 2019, and got a family. My wife and I will have been married in August. We'll have been married 22 years,
Wow.
and we have two kids. I have an 11-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. And we also have a dog that's new. So we're still figuring out how to be dog parents. We're still figuring out how to be human parents too. So, but yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah.
I grew up in Texas, and so been here in the Pacific Northwest for almost 4 years. We love it here, and so grateful that we're here, and thankful for my church, and just it's a joy. So
So why the switch from coming from Texas to here? I mean,
yeah,
why the move?
well, so actually before, so we were in Texas. I grew up there, and then ministry kind of took us some different places. We lived in New Mexico for a while, and then we lived back in
No.
Texas, and then I was the teaching and preaching minister at a church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, from
Mm,
2014 until 2019 when we moved here. So almost 5 years. And yeah, we had felt like it was time for us to make a transition away from Baton Rouge. We didn't know yet
hmm
exactly what we were going to do, and but then the church up here was looking for a new lead pastor, and so um, we have a mutual contact, and so they had asked him if he had anybody he recommended, and I guess he ran out of good recommendations because then he gave them my name, and yeah, so they called and we started that process, and I guess it was late 2018, and then yeah, we moved out here at the end of the summer, August of 2019.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, right before all the fun started with the world changing and
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. Um, yeah. So you said you were a teen pastor, right?
yeah,
How
yeah.
is that? I heard like I from what I know, that's like the hardest ministry to be in.
Yes. I mean, um there's a lot of joy in it. It's a
Mm,
blast. I mean, it's so much fun. It's yeah, it's also it's challenging. It's heartbreaking, you know. I mean, this it's a crucial time in life for young people, and um it's just but it's I don't know, when you're in the middle of it and it's hard, it just feels hard. But
mm,
then later you get to look back and you think, um, I got to walk with people in some really important moments of their life and of their journey, and so that's really special, right? With
yeah.
got to walk with families and parents, and of course, the teens themselves. It's fun watching. They come in as like fifth, sixth graders, 11, 12 years old, and they're so awkward, they and then by the time they leave, they're like adults. It's crazy, and it's so crazy.
Yeah.
And I mean, most of them are adults. Some of them are still working on it, but yeah, so much. There's so much that happens in a person's faith, and in their life journey during those years, and just getting to be part of that is fun.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
and
it's a
I'll say
challenge. Yeah, sorry. No, I was just gonna say it's a
no.
challenge in our culture, I think, because there's so much competition for our time and our attention. And
Mhm.
so, whether it's activities like, sports or music or drama or
Mhm.
just like entertainment, I mean, kids love being online, being with their friends, and it's hard to hold anyone's attention in our culture, whether it's young people or adults. Hard to hold anyone's attention long enough. It's hard to hold my own attention long enough to pay attention to something that matters, that's going to shape me in a good way. And so that's probably one of the hardest things about being a youth pastor, or really just a pastor in general. I mean, I often say, um, like, it's hard to compete with the 24-hour news cycle with adults, right?
Mm-hmm.
I see
Mm-hmm.
people for like an hour a week and may teach some really good things, hopefully. But like,
Mm-hmm.
then if somebody's listening to the culture and the world and 24-hour news the other 167 hours a week, are they going to be, more fearful, more afraid, more polarizing, more political, based on how they're living most of their life, or based on how, that 1 hour a week goes? And so that can be discouraging, but I think it
Yeah.
means what I'm doing is important too. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say this, I remember your first sermon that you gave, and it was so cool because um, you kind of like, I won't say dumb it down, but it's sort of like you were talking to a little bit the young ones, talking to, because I feel like adults can't grasp big theological concepts about this and that, and making something a little bit more simpler for
yeah,
everyone makes it like you can grasp it. You can grasp that a lot better that way. So I feel like your experience definitely working with teens really translates into what you're doing now.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And my joke is that adults are just middle schoolers with a bunch of debt. Um, you know, we
Yeah.
we all need the same things, right? When we're young, when we're teenagers, we need to know the basic things, like, this is who I am, this is who God's calling me to be. Um, you know, the what kind of life do I want to live? What kind of story do I want to tell with the way I live my life? And then when we become adults, we think, well, okay, now my real life's going to begin, and I'm going to do all these other things. But it's all those same questions. And so, yeah, I try to preach and communicate in a way that, I guess also one of my goals in how I communicate is to not be pretentious. I mean, I think, um, I don't know, not to get too theological too deep, or too quickly, but I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the things that Jesus shows us, Jesus showed us that what God looks like with flesh and blood. At least I think that's the claim of the Christian faith,
Mm-hmm.
and that God is not some high and lofty and unapproachable being somewhere
Mm-hmm.
else, but that God's presence dwells right here in our midst. And so much Christian preaching and teaching, so much religious teaching and preaching, I think, can often be, like, just so like uppity, arrogant and pretentious. And I mean, people say God with like a special voice, like God, and they read with a special voice, and I'm just like, I don't think that really transforms us. I think we need to be reminded of God came to be with us in Jesus. And so even as we talk about that, let's be down to earth about it. Let's talk simply with plain words. Doesn't mean that we don't talk about hard or challenging or even difficult to understand things, but let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about them in a way that makes sense. And so that's what
Yeah.
I'm at least trying to do. Sometimes it
Absolutely.
comes out with too many Star Wars or Lord of the Rings quotes, but
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like teenagers nowadays are mostly worried about what other people kind of thinking about them versus, hey, I want to really focus on my belief, like, is there a God, like, really working towards more spiritual things, or are they just consumed by everything that's going on here?
I think it's both. I mean, we know
Mm-hmm.
from adolescent development, that one of the key tasks happening in the emotional development of a teenager in adolescence
Uh-huh.
is self-actualization and differentiation. You know, when we're young, like your child, you know, my children, like when they're babies, they don't really have a concept of self. It's like my I am I exist and I have needs
Mm-hmm.
and my family is me. Like this is just my reality, right? But then as we approach adulthood, we start self-actualizing, and that's actually healthy, right? It manifests itself in sort of the so-called teen rebellion, adolescent rebellion. It's less rebellion and it's more, I'm not my parents.
Mm-hmm.
I am my own self. And then that raises all kinds of questions for us internally. Okay, well then if I'm not my mom or my dad, or I'm not my background, or I'm not my circumstances, then who am I? And then
Mm-hmm.
we start to ask higher order questions of who am I? Who do I want to be? What do I want my life
Mm-hmm.
to be about? What's my
Mm-hmm.
identity rooted in? And so, yes, that's self-centered.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in the midst of that, we're also asking questions like, um, that's a self-actualization process, but we're also realizing I can't just live for myself. I mean, hopefully, right? If
Mm-hmm.
we're going to grow up to be
Mm-hmm.
healthy adults, we're also learning, as I'm learning and deciding who this self is going to be, um, is it going to be totally about myself, or am I going to think about other people? And this is really where then I think religious teaching and moral teaching and character development, um, young people really care about that because they see sort of, they see people out there who have everything and aren't happy. They see people out there who are just living it up
Mm-hmm.
and doing whatever they want, whatever they desire, and they're seeing the consequences of that. And so they're realizing, like, I can't just live that way. And so I am interested in, what does it mean to live a good life and to be a good person? And hopefully that leads them to some sort of meaningful way of ordering the world, some meaningful story. And of course, my faith is the Christian faith. And although the Christian faith isn't the only meaningful story out there, for me, it's the most meaningful story for me, and it's the story I've
Mm-hmm.
chosen to stake my life on,
Mm-hmm.
um, because of what it teaches about love and about compassion, what it teaches about how to treat people, and um, obviously we all do a terrible job of living out those things a lot of times, but they're also thinking
Yeah.
about the kind of person that they want to be, right?
Yeah. And you were saying before we went there, you said love, compassion is just kind of like fits with the story, and that's kind of what you like about Christianity. What about other religions that teach the same thing? Let's say there's, other religions that teach love and passion and being good to others, and
Yeah,
um can people just follow those, or is there like a moral code?
that's a
Or I
great
know it's I know
question.
it's a I know it's a whole thing, but if you could just kind of clarify that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think a proper response would probably take an entire other
Yeah.
episode, which
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily pitching.
Yeah.
There are better qualified people to talk about that than me. But what I would say is sort of a two-part answer on that.
Mm-hmm.
One is, on the one hand, there are absolutely things that many of the world religions share in common, and I
Mm-hmm.
I can celebrate that. I can say, I have Muslim neighbors. Um, I have agnostic neighbors who believe that they should love their neighbors as they love themselves, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
something Jesus said, but they believe that. I have neighbors who are of different flavors within the Christian faith.
Mm-hmm.
There's people all around us, Jewish people and Hindu people and all kinds of people. And I would say, on the one hand, I celebrate the things that we share in common. and we
Hmm.
can work together for great good in the world in partnership. And so I want to celebrate those things any way that I can. I also I want to honor each one of those, whether it be a religious tradition or a philosophical tradition. I want to honor their truth claims by not trying to force everybody into the same mold, right? And
Okay.
so it's not honoring of a Muslim neighbor to assume we're talking about the same reality, the same picture of God. Some people want to collapse it all down. It's like, oh yeah, it's all the same God. And I want to say, well, I mean, I believe there's one God. That's what I believe. Um, but I don't think our religious traditions are the same. And to try to say that they're the same actually does a great disservice to the Christian
Hmm.
faith or to Islam or to Hinduism or to any sort of
Hmm.
other thing. And so it's in and this word may be misunderstood in our culture a lot, but it's in the
Hmm.
exclusive claims of each
Hmm.
religion or tradition that I think you really find some of their greatest good. It,
Hmm.
Christians could learn a lot from our Islamic friends about the concept of submission to God's will, right?
Hmm.
Something Islam takes very seriously. And there's not enough Christians out there who take seriously enough the principle of submission to God's will, right?
Hmm.
And so that's something that we can learn from each other, right?
Yeah.
And likewise, there's things about the Christian faith that I think people in other faith traditions can learn from Christianity. And so, yeah, obviously, Jesus said of himself, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." And I believe that's true. Um, and I also have to acknowledge some people, if they're honest, like I would say, is your goal to get to the Father? And they would say, no. And I'm like, okay, then maybe Jesus isn't for you. I mean, I think Jesus is for everybody. I just want to say that. And I have no problem saying that. But I also
Hmm.
want to recognize that the claims that the Christian faith is making may be very different. They are very different than what a lot of other religious traditions are. And it's okay to acknowledge that, right? To be honest about that.
Let's just jump into our topic.
Yes, sounds good.
Yeah. So porn is a $13 trillion industry, larger than Microsoft, Google, Apple, Amazon, and Netflix combined.
Wow. Yeah.
So, what do you think about how common porn is today as a pastor?
Yeah. That's an astounding number, first of all. I think it speaks to the human desire for connection. I
Hmm.
mean, really, all of those industries that you just mentioned are about human connection, right?
Hmm.
Technology is fun. I mean, our phones they're fun toys, but really the reason that we use them most of the time is to connect with other people. I mean, not just the phone
Hmm.
function, but we record our lives. We take video, we send texts, we're on social media. Those are
Hmm.
all rooted fundamentally in a desire to connect deeply with other people. And that's what I think, from a Christian perspective, believing that we're all created in God's image and
Hmm.
that we're hardwired to desire connection with other people. So I think pornography, like way deep down underneath, the behavior
Hmm.
itself, um, deep down inside us, there's a desire to know others and to be known by others. And there's some way that that's not being filled in our lives, which then causes us to seek out all kinds of other behaviors that we know are destructive to us and other people, right? Whether that's addiction or belonging to a group that does terrible things, but I feel like I belong and I feel like I'm known, right? Or whether it's an addiction like pornography, where it manufactures um, sort of a counterfeit version of intimacy and connection.
Hmm.
It's not the real thing, but it mimics it enough in our brains, in our hearts, in our bodies that it's understandable to see why so many people participate in it, right? And it's heartbreaking because of Again, even people who have no faith background are learning about the psychological impacts and the cultural impacts of so many people participating in the pornography industry, whether as consumers or creators. And it's having a pretty huge impact in our world and on our culture. As a Christian pastor, it's like my fundamental desire in my calling is I want to lead people to full life in Jesus. I think Jesus says he came to give us abundant life, the fullest kind of life possible. Um, and I think we know fundamentally, most of us know that that's a life of love and community and connection, a life that is joining God and making the world better for everyone. And so it's devastating to know that so many people are participating in something that is hurting. It's hurting ourselves and it's hurting other people. Um, the Jewish faith has this concept of shalom. It's this idea that um, everything in its right place. It gets translated as peace, but it's a peace that's a wholeness, a fullness of everything, between everything and everyone. It's a
Mm.
harmony, a unity between you and me, between people, between us and God, within our own hearts. And so shalom is the world ordered as it should be. And I think the Judeo-Christian concept of sin is not necessarily a breaking of a rule as much as it is a disruption of shalom. It's a destroying of the wholeness that needs to exist between and within all people. And so pornography is so destructive because it disrupts shalom within the self. It disrupts shalom between people. And it obviously has impacts between us and our relationship with God, right? And our relationships with other people. And so,
Yeah, I'll say this. There was a study done, and they came back with that every second, 30,000 people click play on a porn video.
wow.
30,000 people every single second.
Yeah.
And what would you say to someone? You kind of mentioned this a little bit. What would you say to someone who says, "Okay, I get it. I understand it's bad or wrong, but hey, I use it as an outlet. Let's say, instead of going out there and doing bad things
Mhm.
or, actually going after women, hey, I am just using this as an outlet by myself and it seems
Yeah.
to be okay."
Yeah. I would say that's a distortion of a principle that in certain contexts can be a helpful thing to say. Now, there's a
Mhm.
bunch of caveats to that.
Mhm.
Um, I'll use the book of Psalms in the Bible as an example of positively what I'm trying to say. There's Psalms where the people write poetry that says really hard things like, God, the world's awful. Where are you? Why won't you fix everything? And God, there's a bunch of terrible people out there. And God, I want to kill those people and stop them and do horrible things to them. But instead of actually doing it, God, I'm just going to tell you all the things I want to do to those people. And on the one hand, I think God eventually wants to shape our hearts so that we're no longer being rooted in hatred. That's
Mhm.
that's the ultimate goal, right? God wants to
Mhm.
shape our hearts so we become people of love. But in the meantime, is God more satisfied that I'm at least talking to him, or that I'm at least talking to God about my desire to hurt other people instead of actually hurting them? Well, yes, that's an improvement over I actually went out and murdered the person, right?
Mhm.
But I'm still on the continuum. And Jesus comes along later and says this about anger in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. He says, when you're angry with someone, you're actually still on the continuum towards murder. And so you've got to learn to let God shape your heart into love rather than just stoking a flame of anger at other people, right? And so all of that is to say, I think there's some similarities with lust and pornography. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, if I went out and had an affair with somebody and cheated on my wife, that would be a horrible thing to do. And that would hurt her, it would hurt me, it would hurt the other person and their relationships. It would hurt my church, it'd hurt my children, it'd hurt a lot of people. It would disrupt a lot of shalom. It would make the world less good and beautiful. And so in a sense, is doing something that's just essentially between me and a screen less wrong? Well, no, I mean, it's not less wrong. It's wrong in a different way. Did it prevent me from doing something more concretely devastating in my own life? Well, yes, but it doesn't mean that it's a good and healthy outlet. And so I want to say all that to say, like, on the one hand, if watching porn is, if right now with my level of self-control, if that's the only thing preventing me from going out and sleeping with all the people, is that an improvement? Well, maybe that's a small baby step in the right direction towards doing less terrible things, but it shouldn't be a sustainable way of life, right? And that's where I would say, same thing with anything. Like if I have a glass of wine with dinner or something, right? There shouldn't be anything wrong with that. But if I need a glass of wine, or if I need 5 glasses of wine or whatever, if I need 10 glasses of wine a day, now all of a sudden that's become a way of life and I've been mastered by something. And I'm using that to avoid really living a more deeply fulfilling life, right? And so I guess that's what I would say is that it can be an outlet, and it most certainly is for a lot of people, but that doesn't mean that that's a good thing. We were made to live better stories than that and a better life than that, right? So
yeah, and I would say we don't know the consequences of that. So it might be an outlet, right? But we don't know how that would affect you in months. That's 3, 4 months, 5 months, because we crave, when we have that dopamine rush, right, and it's over, we want that to happen again and again and again. So we take riskier steps to get to that.
Yes. Yeah, there's a principle, I think it's called the law of diminishing returns. And I'm probably getting this wrong, but the idea is this happens with any kind of addiction. The first time you do if it's a drug or if it's thrill seeking or if it's pornography or whatever it is, the first time, huge high, whatever it is. But then the longer that you use it or do those things, you get diminishing returns on the actions until eventually you reach a state where you're no longer up here normally, you're way down here. And then you've got to do the addiction just to get up to your new low baseline just to function, right? And at that point you've been completely mastered by something, and you've even forgotten that you used to live life up here all the time, right? And so that law of diminishing return, I think that's a real thing. And we are learning, I guess with neuroscience and mental health and psychology, like there's studies that have been done now, long-term studies, scientific peer-reviewed studies, right? This is not just some Christian pastor who like made a survey monkey and sent it out to his congregation, and I'm an expert now. No, I mean, these are people with the most advanced degrees, genius people who have done these studies, and they're basically saying, pornography, any kind of addiction, like this is what it does. This is what it does to your brain. It's what it does to your body. It's what it does over time in your life. Yeah. And there are internal consequences. There are emotional and spiritual consequences. I'd say there's even physiological consequences, right?
Mhm.
When you are addicted to something, um, you know, I wrestle. I have a complicated relationship with food. You and I were talking about this the last time that we had
Mhm.
lunch together, and I just, I want to eat all the ice cream, right?
Mhm.
And it's there, it's there to eat, and I want to eat it. And obviously, it's easy to see the correlation between that behavior and its consequences. If I eat all the ice cream, I gain weight, I don't feel as good, um, my body changes, you know. And with something like pornography, it's the distance between the immediate noticeable effects in our lives and in our hearts, the distance between that and the action itself seems so far removed that it's easy to
Mhm.
think, yeah, this isn't really affecting me. I can keep doing this perpetually, and it's not gonna impact me, right? And then yeah, then there's also, of course, social and cultural and global implications of this behavior as well, right? Um, I want to use chocolate as an analogy. Um, there are places where the cocoa beans that are harvested to make chocolate for the big candy companies in the world,
Mhm.
that on the ground level where those cocoa beans are being harvested, the child labor is being utilized, right?
Mhm.
Unjust working conditions, and this has been highlighted, right? I mean, there's been documentaries made on this kind of stuff, right? And so theoretically, I ought to think about that before I go out and buy chocolate, right? In an ideal world, I would not
Mhm.
support buying chocolate from a company that utilizes child labor on another continent to make the product that I'm going to
Mhm.
enjoy, right? I should, maybe I should look for fair trade chocolate, or chocolate that's, there's organizations out there that give scores based on, how just this product was made, right? That's the debate with all the
Mhm.
electronic vehicles and stuff, right? The batteries to make, yeah, maybe it helps the environment to not put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but the to exploit the resources needed to make all the batteries is also damaging the planet. And so we have to make these decisions. And I know that seems so far removed maybe from pornography, but that when we watch or when we click, we are supporting an industry, right? We are perpetuating a system and an industry that we know it doesn't just exploit the people who are on the screen, some of them who may not be there by their own volition or will, right? They may have been trafficked. They may be being compelled or forced to do things against their will. We know that there's a link between human trafficking and pornography, that there's a lot of overlap between those two injustices. And so, yeah, that's what I would say is like, yeah, when you become one of those 30,000 people each second, is it each second or each minute?
Each second, every second.
Each second, yeah. When you become one of those 30,000 clicks, you are perpetuating a global system that dehumanizes and traffics people. What we're watching, what we're consuming, is not we're not what we're participating in is not true intimacy. It's not the thing that we're really
Yeah.
seeking beneath the thing, beneath the thing, beneath the thing.
Yeah.
It's a counterfeit of it. And um, the I guess the industry, it seems, has become increasingly talented at creating better and better counterfeits because it's creating and generating more and more participation, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's easier than ever to participate in all of that. And yeah, but it's not. That's the thing. It's the same thing with ice cream, right? Like my body craves nutrition, and although ice cream has some nutritious things in it, right? Milk can be a good and healthy thing. but it's also got a
Hmm.
whole bunch of other like stuff created in a synthetic lab that's not even real and it's not good for me. And I'm just consuming it, right? Similar thing. Like that's a real person on the screen or on the page or whatever, a real person that you could theoretically have real intimacy with given the right circumstances. But we have to remind ourselves, but that's not what this is, right? Just like ice cream isn't a nutritious diet, like this isn't really the thing that I'm after. And this brings up, I think, a principle that I don't remember where I first heard this, but it says, somebody said, don't sacrifice what you want the most for what you want right now,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's what pornography says. Like, you want this right now. You want a feeling, you want a feel
Hmm.
good feeling. Underneath that, yeah, you know, you want intimacy, right? That's the thing you want the most. The thing you want the most is human connection, intimacy with
Yeah.
another person. But you'll sacrifice that for this counterfeit thing that you can have right now. And
Yeah.
that's what's really heartbreaking about it is, you know, not because it's like breaking a list of rules, as much as it's people choosing something that's less than life, right? I mean, we have all these dystopian future movies where someone's like plugged into the Matrix, and we're like, that's
Hmm.
not real life because they're just plugged into an experience that isn't really happening,
Yeah.
right? And we say, oh, that's so sad. I hope that the world never becomes that way. And then we click on our video, right?
Yeah.
And we're living that out right here in the moment.
About you, but I've never met anyone, any male, any adult male who said, you know what, I watch porn, yes, and it's awesome. No, 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 this is incredible. I think
Yeah.
deep inside we all know, like you're describing, that this is not okay. Like this is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
shame associated with it for sure. Yeah. And it's also worth
Yeah.
mentioning, I think, too, that this is not just something that heterosexual men wrestle with, right?
Yeah.
Pornography affects every kind of person imaginable, right? It is um, all kinds of people with all
Yeah.
kinds of different sexual orientations or preferences. Um, they all kinds of people participate in this experience, and it objectifies. You used the idea that it objectifies, it turns this, you know, you mentioned like a woman, for a man who's watching a woman, it turns her into an object, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's part of the problem with pornography is that it's dehumanizing to everybody involved. It diminishes, like from a Christian perspective, it diminishes the image of God that's inside each person. Um, I objectify the person on the screen. I'm just using them for my own pleasure, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I'm also dehumanizing myself. I'm choosing to live out a diminished version of my own life, and so I'm dehumanizing myself as well, right? Not living fully, and so yeah,
So as a pastor, what are some consequences that you've seen you've seen people experience because they've been so into porn?
yeah, yeah. I mean, the first consequence is just, I mean, yeah, it hurts marriages. I mean, I know of some marriages that have ended because of pornography, you know? Yeah, that neither spouse went out and physically had an affair with anybody else, but um, you know, it, the husband, you know, I know of several examples where the husband was just, you know, mastered by porn, and you know, and his wife just um, you know, from a Christian perspective, you know, Jesus talks about that lust and adultery are on the same, they're on the same continuum, right? That they're connected, that looking at another person with lust in your heart, objectifying them, which is one of the things pornography does, that's like committing adultery with somebody in your heart. And really what you want in a marriage and in a covenant relationship is you want the two people's hearts to be in covenant with one another, right? And so even when a physical act hasn't necessarily occurred, when there's been a violation of that covenant of my heart would rather, pursue lust and connection with and objectifying of this other person rather than connecting with the person that I'm in a covenant relationship with, that does something damaging and devastating in the relationship. And so, wives who say, I don't want to share my husband with people on a computer screen. I don't think that's an unreasonable request for a spouse to make, to say, hey, you ought not to ever do that, right? It is kind of the same as going out and sleeping with other people, right? Because although the actions are different, what's happening in your heart is on a similar plane. It's on a similar continuum. And so that's definitely one of the devastating consequences that I've seen as a pastor, and then even short of that, people who are unsatisfied in their marriages, right? The solution, like if there's a husband who's unsatisfied in his relationship sexually with his wife, the goal is then to not seek sexual satisfaction in other things and other people. It's to work on your relationship with your wife, right? And to work through that. And so I guess that's probably more sort of the low simmering boil in most relationships, is that just an acceptance of that this is the way life is going to be. And so I'll just be married and not be satisfied, and then go over here and do these other things, right? That's heartbreaking to know that that's happening in so many marriages, probably maybe even a majority of marriages, right? And so that's sad. It has consequences on our kids. I'd say to people out there, your kids probably are, especially your teenagers, especially when it comes to technology, they're smarter than you. So I'd tell all the adults out there, your teenagers are probably aware if you're using porn, because they know how to find out. I mean, like, your teen could probably set up a proxy server in your home on your internet and on your Wi-Fi, and then monitor everything that you're doing, right? Find out all the passwords and all the things. Like, they probably already know all that anyways. And so your kids, when your kids become aware that you're doing that, like, that's hurtful to them too, right? So it's not just between you and your spouse. And then of course it hurts yourself and all the ways that we've talked about, the negative impacts it has on your heart. So
absolutely. And I feel like, and before we jumped on this podcast, I kind of was looking at a few videos of people talking about this subject on YouTube, and opening up comments and just reading comments, scrolling through comments, and so many, especially I've noticed, men who said, hey, this is bad. I started this when I was 16. I've been doing this for 40 years. I'm now divorced. Please stop. So many people are like, I feel horrible. Please stop. You just scroll through and just your heart hurts for people who are suffering through this, and you're just, so many people are in pain. And that's what I've never seen somebody say, oh no, this is fantastic, this is good for you. No, because I feel like it just not just distorts, like we talked about, your heart, and basically your mind becomes just this thing where you're like, oh, you have certain expectations now. You're like, oh, this is how it's supposed to be, because an average age of exposure to porn is 11 years old. That's an average. That's crazy. That's not how it's supposed to be, you know. And out of 3,000 evangelical church members, there was a survey done where anonymously over 77% view porn at least monthly.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
It's just,
and I think
this whole
yeah. It's, and you mentioned something there too that I think is important. You, back to the earlier question just about its effects, negative effects, is when you watch porn, it changes your expectations of what sex and sexuality is going to be like, right? And I think I saw a study, and I don't remember where this was, and so maybe I'm wrong about this. I'll give that disclaimer, but it was interviewing. It had surveyed younger people. So I'm in my early 40s, and it was interviewing like especially young women like in their 20s, and talking about like, do they feel pressure to basically to perform, because all the young men that they're encountering are just their life is so saturated with pornography that they have certain expectations of what a sexual encounter is going to be like. And so then these young women are like, I don't want to do those things, but every guy I meet expects me to do things that they saw in a video that the woman on the video was doing, and again, that doesn't just affect men and women in those ways. It affects everybody, but I think that can damage a marriage. It can damage, because then all of a sudden, you're importing something that is probably not very realistic, and maybe not mutual, right? Sexual covenant union in a marriage should be about mutual respect, mutual enjoyment, right? Should be about honoring the other person as they honor you, right? And there's beauty in that. And any sexual act, even within a marriage, that violates those principles is not, I think, ideal. It's not what God has in mind for our relationships, right? And so this idea of that people are expecting of their partners to do things that's not mutually honoring, or whatever, or is against the will of the other person. That's destructive, damages the relationship. And I think the more that happens, it has a snowball effect. Who wants to continue being intimate with somebody if you always feel like you're disappointing them because you're not living up to some ideal that they have, that they got from somebody else? Like that's terrible. Right?
That is so true. And I feel like, that's probably, I don't know, you tell me what you think, erectile dysfunction, like all these things come to play. Well, because the man or the female, they're bored. They're like, oh, that doesn't get my dopamine up. This is nothing. I need something more exciting in my life, right?
Yeah.
And
I think that touches on something too. Yeah, there's all kinds of physical problems, right? Not just emotional or spiritual problems, but that touches on something else as well, that that when you have you become attached to an idea of something, and it's no longer about intimacy. It's only then about pleasure, right? It removes, it decenters, sexuality involves physical pleasure, emotional pleasure, spiritual pleasure. It involves all those things, but it's really centered in in connection and intimacy, relationship, covenant. These are all wonderful, beautiful things. It's centered on that. But our culture really has, and not just our culture. I mean, religious people do this too, but we've allowed a narrative about sexuality to take root in our lives that decenters sexuality away from all of those good things and roots it completely in a sensation, a moment,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
a climax, a feeling, pleasure, my own pleasure. Um, when you decenter something like that from its intended purpose, that's when it becomes destructive and not what it was meant to be, right? Not denying that there should be pleasure and enjoyment involved, right? This isn't like
Hmm.
some Puritan, like religious fundamentalist, like you're not allowed to enjoy sexual pleasure. God doesn't want you to be happy. God doesn't want you to enjoy anything. Those are false pictures of God, right? God designed us to enjoy this
Yeah.
and to have intimacy, and what a beautiful thing that is, right? It's the distortion
Yeah.
of that that's so destructive. And so yeah, there's a
So
lot there.
how would you define habitual sin?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, because I mean, on the one hand, um, let me use cussing as an example. If I stub my toe and I drop a cuss word out of reaction,
Hmm.
on the one hand, like, okay, maybe that's not that big of a deal, right? Um, unless I've so nurtured saying that and thinking that it has become a part of who I am. So that then anytime anything undesirable happens in my life, whether it's stubbing a toe or getting cut off in traffic, if the first place I go is to use harsh language that doesn't build up other people, right? Um, then I've got a problem, right? And I guess that's one of the differences, right? We all make mistakes, um, and so that yeah, I'd say there's mistakes, there's there's moments of weakness where we make an intentional decision of sin, and then there's what you're calling habitual sin or living in sin, right? Everybody makes mistakes, right? I say things from time to time. I don't even mean anything by it, um, but I hurt someone's feelings, and I find out later, oh man, I said something and I hurt this person, and now I need to make that right. So maybe that's a mistake or it's an oversight. Um, Sometimes I say things to people because I'm mad and I'm not managing myself well in the moment, and I know that what I'm about to say is going to hurt them, right? That's sin. It's broken
Hmm.
shalom, right? And if I'm the kind of person that is always nurturing that kind of behavior, then I'm living in that sin of not building up other people, right? So as it relates to pornography and lust or adultery or whatever it is, objectifying other people, dehumanizing other people. Um, yeah, I mean, there's going to be moments, you know, I was at a baseball game one time, Texas Rangers baseball game, and I'm there with some other people I know, and all of a sudden here comes this woman who's walking up the steps to, go get something to drink or something. And she was attractive, and she was, all of the features that our culture celebrates in beauty, uh were, you know, this woman had all of those qualities. Um and every every row that she walked past, every man, every person was just like, turning and watching. On the one hand, I mean, did God create us to appreciate the beauty of what God creates? Okay. Yeah, there's a point there to be made about, um, can I acknowledge the beauty? I mean, Andy, you're a handsome fellow, right? I can acknowledge your beauty, you're made in the image of God. I can say you're a great, we can acknowledge the beauty of what God's created. There's a difference in that and looking and staring with an intent to objectify and just enjoy this person as an object because of how that makes me feel. See, then I've crossed the line from appreciating beauty to sin and objectifying and lusting after another person, right? And so I would say living in sin is, or habitual sin is when we just then start to make excuses. Well, you know what? That's just the way it's going to be. I can't help it. A beautiful woman walks by. I just have to look at her in a way that objectifies her and has all kinds of thoughts about her. I mean, I'm a male, I'm a red-blooded man, and that's just the way that the world is, right? That's excuse making for objectifying another person, right? That's habitual sin. It's living and accepting something about myself and my behavior and my thoughts that I'm refusing to take ownership over, right? And I mean, the good news is that God's exceedingly patient with us as he tries to mold and shape us into better and more loving people. But God needs our participation also in that, right? God's not going to force us to become holy. God wants our participation in that. And so we've got to figure out ways to both receive God's grace, but then also participate with God in God's grace towards us in a way that will lead to our transformation. We shouldn't just be satisfied with, oh, you know what? I'm just a red-blooded American male, and this is the way it is, and we live in a culture saturated with sexuality, and so I'm just gonna stare at people and think thoughts about them because I'm just gonna click on the screen. I'm just gonna do the things, right? No, we, all of us, we've got to take ownership. We are responsible for our hearts and our thoughts, and thank God that God is exceedingly grace-filled and patient with us, but we are invited to participate with God in our own transformation.
Right.
To resist that
one.
movement is to resist what the Spirit of God wants to do in us. It's to frustrate the Spirit of God in us, right? So
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like for Christians, there's a lot more, I guess, things that they have to be aware of versus a non-Christian, right? Someone who doesn't believe in God because they have no one really to answer to but themselves. So they're like, oh, I just want to feel better. I'm struggling with this, but I feel better. As a Christian, though, someone might, say, hey, but Jesus forgives. So, I mean, porn is just like lying, right? We all lie. We all or say a lie once in a while, and you can call it habitual living in sin or whatever you want to call it. I'm falling like everyone else. Some persons lie. Some person says this. Some person cusses. Whatever. This is my kind of like cross that I'm carrying, that I'm struggling with.
right.
And yes, I'm doing it habitually, but you know what? God is good, and over time, I can potentially get rid of it. If that one has that mentality, is that a good mentality to have or not?
Yeah, no, I mean, ultimately, no, because I think we are, I think God wants to empower us. We're leaving empowerment on the table when we do that, right? We're settling for less. God wants, I think, to empower. One of the sort of scandalous claims of the Christian faith is that God's Spirit, the very presence of God, dwells in people who are being transformed by Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first Christians, Paul, writes in one of his letters, it's a book in the Bible called Galatians. He talks about the fruit of the Spirit, that when you participate with God's Spirit living inside you to transform you into a fully alive person who's joined God in what God wants to do to repair and restore all things, When you've joined with the Spirit in that and you participate, then it's this metaphor of a tree. Then the fruit that's going to grow from your life, from your tree, is going to be fruit that looks like God's Spirit, right? And what does that Spirit look like? What is God's Spirit like? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, right? Self-control is that last one that's mentioned there. And when you participate, you submit to God's transformation in your life, then over time, the fruit of your life, of your behavior, your actions, your thoughts should start to taste more like that fruit of all of those things, those 9 things that are mentioned, right? Which includes self-control. And so, yeah, to somebody who says, I just really wrestle with self-control. Well, I mean, yeah, we all do. Okay. But in Christ, we shouldn't be satisfied with, I just wrestle with that. And so that's just going to be my struggle. No, I can celebrate God's grace and patience towards me and embrace that and hold that and be thankful for it and say, and God, please continue to transform me in humility and make me better, make me new, transform my mind and my heart, renew my spirit. King David, the Jewish king, wrote in the Psalms, in Psalm 51, he says, create in me a clean heart, God, and renew a right spirit in me. Do not cast me away from your presence. Don't take your Holy Spirit from me, but instead restore the joy of your salvation and renew a right and steadfast spirit inside me, right? Those are powerful words. That's a powerful prayer to pray to God, to say, God, I'm broken and flawed. You know that I wrestle with this, but God, by your power, not by my power, but by your power and with my cooperation, God, you can restore my life. You can give me a joy, a deep joy that's deeper than whatever these desires are that are taking me away from what you have for me. So
what I hear you saying is, and tell me if I'm not hearing it correctly, we as Christians are supposed to have, we have God in us, right? God with us, in us all the time. And when we consume something like, we're in different habitual sins, either lying, porn, whatever we're in, that distances that from God, right? I mean, that doesn't you're not lost, but that if you're in something that's habitual like that, you kind of need to overview and see, hey, how's my relationship with God?
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and let me say a couple things about that. One picture that people have, let me use a metaphor of like your house or my house. My wife and I, we have a relationship, obviously, and sometimes it's good and healthy, and then we have rough patches, rough seasons, just like everyone, and but we're always trying to nurture wholeness and fullness and joy and happiness in our relationship and mutual love and covenant, all those good things, right? There have been seasons when our relationship is in a rocky patch and we still dwell together. Now, I know this isn't always the case. Sometimes people separate or they divorce, but in our case, we've always stayed under the same roof. But we'll just say that the temperature's gotten colder, right, between us.
Mm-hmm.
We're still dwelling together, but all is not warm and good and happy in the house and in the relationship. And I bring that up to say some people's view of God, and I think this is a false view of God, is that if I'm in Christ and I have the Spirit of God, but then I sin,
Mm-hmm.
Um, that God moves out of the house because God can't be
Mm-hmm.
around my sin. And I would say, no, God still dwells and abides in the
Mm-hmm.
house. God still dwells in the house and loves me and wants relationship and intimacy, wants wholeness and goodness for all of us in the house. I turned the thermostat down, right? I did something that threw cold water on and damages, potentially damages the relationship, but God's the one who keeps showing up and dwelling in the house and in the relationship, right? And so I want to clarify that, right? Some Christians even have this false view of God that no, if you screw up, God's going to flee and go away from you and doesn't want to be
Mm-hmm.
around you anymore. And I think the radical scandal of the gospel of the good news is that no, God doesn't abandon his children, right? God doesn't abandon the work in us. He's going to be faithful to bring us to completion as his masterpiece, right? And so, um, yeah, but when I don't participate in that relationship because I'm choosing sin, habitual sin, um, I'm frustrating God's attempts to make me whole and to give me fullness of life, right? And the solution to that is God continues to dwell and abide. I'm invited to dwell and abide with God and to be transformed by God's presence and grace so that I hopefully increasingly do less and less of those things that are robbing me of life, taking me away from God, all those things, right? So there's good news and bad news in that. The good news is that God's always faithful. The bad news is that life's hard and we're flawed and broken. We still carry with us, even for Christians, who are supposedly being transformed, we still carry wounds, consequences, lifelong
Mm-hmm.
consequences of things that we have done, shame, guilt. We bring all that into the house with us, and God wants to help us work through all that as well.
There's different consequences again to sin, so those will
Absolutely.
still happen in your life. Those will absolutely still happen in your life.
God rarely saves us or protects us from the consequences of our actions, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. To the person whose life is in ruins and they say, God, why did you let this happen to me? I mean, there's sometimes when that's an appropriate question to ask. That's a natural question to ask, but um, lots of times there's a pretty direct line, linear correlation of like, yeah, I made choices and these are the consequences of those choices. And God, sometimes I can look back and God did spare me from some consequences. I did some things as a young man,
Yeah.
and my friends who did the same things have lifelong consequences.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to experience those consequences. And I mean, call it blessing, call it luck, call it whatever you want to call it. I'm thankful that I didn't have those consequences. It's
Yeah.
humbling too, right? It's like, why did they have to experience those consequences and I didn't? That's humbling to me because who am I? Like, I'm not better than them. I did the same thing they did. Um, yeah,
Yeah, we just don't want, somebody watching this be like, "Oh, well, hey," kind of gives you a license to continue on and be like, "Well,
yeah,
God is forgiving. He knows I'm struggling with this.
yeah,
Yes, he's still with me, but I can continue yeah, I'm still in this, but my mind hates it, but I guess my heart loves it because I'm coming back to it, and I'm
yeah,
still doing this sin, but I'm still saved. I'm still saved. God just is
right.
disappointed in me. So that's why we'll make the distinction where
Yeah,
yes, like you said it yourself. You said yes and no, where you'll still experience the consequences of that sin, but
yeah,
that necessarily doesn't mean that God is like, okay, I never knew you. Get out of here. You're done.
right.
But yeah,
Yeah, and for all the Christians out there listening to this, like, I mean, go back and read what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 6. He says, just because God's grace is awesome, does that mean that I have a license to do whatever I want and just keep on sinning? In fact, he's like, God's grace is a good thing. And if I sin, and that means God's grace has to increase, well, isn't more of God's grace a good thing? So I should sin on purpose. And Paul
Yeah.
says, like, no, by no means. Like, that's Paul's ancient Greek way of saying, like, heck no, don't do that. Don't live that way. And then what he says, you don't live that way. You don't just take that as license to do whatever you want. And then he says this, he says, because when you came to Jesus, or rather when Jesus came to you and you received him, like that old you died. And so that person shouldn't and can't live any longer, right? You
Mm.
died to sin, Paul wrote. So you can't live that way anymore. You have to start not living by the flesh, but to live by the Spirit, and to find your life in God's Spirit, and to drink deeply from the well of God's grace, yes, but also God's transformation in your life, right? So
No, interesting.
yeah, it's not a
So,
license to just
but
do whatever we want.
what would you say? Um, what can a Christian, male, female, t- take? What kind of steps can they take first in order to get out of the sin of habitual pornography?
Yes. Oh, great question. So I'll start with sort of a spiritual point, and then I have some practical suggestions
Hmm.
too. Um, the spiritual point is sort of two things. One is um, you can't, right? This is going to sound so super cliche, like this is the most cliche pastor thing ever to say, but like you can't, but God can, right? Um, you trying to like white knuckle the steering wheel, right? And by your own willpower change your own life. Um, if you had the willpower to do that, you would have done it already, right? Because what you said earlier is true. Like we know deep down inside this isn't good for us. And if I had the willpower to stop by my own power, I would have done it already. And so the first step is, and this is why recovery programs are so helpful to so many people, whether it's a Christian based recovery program like Celebrate Recovery, or whether it's more generalized like AA or something like that. Recovery programs all start with that same concept. You have to acknowledge that you are powerless to overcome these things on your own, and you have to rely on power outside of yourself, right? And then depending on if it's Christian based or other, whether it's God or whether it's a mentor or whether it's some higher calling or whatever it is, but all of it's a version of the truth is that, yeah, you have to start with I can't by my own strength and will and volition get out of this hole, right? Um, the second, I think, spiritual truth in that is that I have to want something else more than whatever this desire is, right? Um, have I defined what I want the most? In the Christian faith, that would be Jesus. It would be God's grace and God's love. So I would say that's the first step, is to say, you know, be honest with yourself. This thing has a hold of me. I'm it has It has taken hold of my life. I've been mastered by this thing. I don't have power over it. It's got power over me. And I am not going to get myself out of this ditch by my own willpower, volition, ingenuity, creativity, or tenacity. My presence and my work and my commitment is going to need to be involved, but it's not going to
Mhm.
be by my own power alone, right? Um, and so I would say that's a great first spiritual step. The next spiritual step that I would say that people can take is to to realize and articulate your yes your ultimate yes that you want to say yes to. What kind of person do you want to be? What does the good life consist of? Right? And taking some time to say, what is it that I want the most? I mean, yes, it's the appeal of pornography or alcohol or entertainment or whatever it is that's got a hold of me. Ice cream, I've talked about ice cream. Whatever it is that's got a hold of me, the appeal of that is very strong. But what do I want the most, right? I want intimacy with God. I want connection and intimacy with people around me. And so I want that more than I want this momentary pleasure or experience. I think once you've defined your yes, this is the kind of person I want to be, you suddenly have a lot more power to say no to anything that gets in the way of that. Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Um, I was trying to remember, and I don't remember who said this, but they said willpower isn't enough if it's just you against the decision. You have to want something else more than you want the thing that you want now. And so don't sacrifice what you want the most for what you want now. And so I would say those are kind of the big sort of spiritual things that I'd say if somebody's like, man, I need to get out of this thing. It's got a hold of me. I'm powerless over it and I need help. And I need to know what I want most, the things that I want most deeply in life, so that I can do those. And then there's a whole bunch of practical stuff that I think can be helpful. First of all, I would encourage anybody who's dealing with anything, a recovery program. Recovery programs are not just for I know most people think of alcoholics, they think of drug addicts, they think of gamblers, Gamblers Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, but there are recovery programs for almost everything. Celebrate Recovery. We have a Celebrate Recovery chapter at our church at Van Church that meets on Wednesday nights. And they just say it's for anybody who has any sort of hurt, hang up, or habit. And I would say that's all of us. We all have hurts, hang-ups, and habits that have a hold on us, that are robbing us of life and hurting us and the people around us. And we need God's help to work through those habits, those hurts, and those hang-ups. And so I would say as a practical step, I'm thankful for this movement in our culture. I mean, I think a generation ago there was such a stigma involved with getting help, asking for help, getting counseling, going to recovery. There was so much shame and stigmatization on that people were ashamed to admit that they needed help. And I'm thankful. I think there's a cultural movement that's a positive thing, where people are more willing to see the importance of that and to embrace it and to say, yeah, no, it matters to work through your stuff and to be a healthier person and to get the help that you need. So go to recovery. There are counselors, there's professional counselors who specialize in people who have addictions to sex and pornography and lust and all those. And some of those people they'll counsel you from a religious background if that's your desire. Some people it's not from any sort of religious perspective, but they can be helpful as well. And so that's a practical step. And then I want to point you to a resource. It's not a religious resource at all, but it's a guy named James Clear. He wrote a book called Atomic Habits in there that have been helpful to me, where it's basically like, I wrote them down because I thought I might want to mention them. He says, he's got 4 laws to change your habits. The first one is, if you're trying to start a new habit that's positive, you make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, and make it satisfying. And that will help you build a better habit. Likewise, if you're trying to deconstruct a bad habit, it's the opposite of all those things. He said, so you invert all those laws, and if you have a bad habit and you can make it invisible, make it unattractive, make it difficult, and make it unsatisfying, then you're more likely to stop doing that sooner rather than later. And so I would say with lust, with pornography, if you can make it invisible, unattractive, difficult, and unsatisfying, you're going to help yourself as you're trying to participate with God's grace in God helping you to get out of that, right? The Christian faith has numerous spiritual disciplines as well. I think that are right there to help us on the journey. They're not laws like you got to do this or God doesn't like you, but they're helpful practices. Author Dallas Willard, who wrote a bunch of books about spiritual formation and about becoming more like Christ, he often said, we want to have the same kind of willpower that Jesus had over sin and temptation, but very few of us want to live the life that Jesus lived. And if you look at the life that Jesus lived, he lived a life of spiritual discipline. He prayed, he fasted, he often withdrew to lonely places to spend time in the presence of God. He wasn't just busy all the time. He did things that helped him reconnect with the core story of what he wanted to be about the most. And it's like he trained, right? I mean, you imagine like the Rocky montage with the music playing, Eye of the Tiger is playing, and Rocky's running and beating on the dead meat carcass in the freezer, and you're so motivated, and you're like, man, I want to be tough and be able to fight like Rocky. And it's like, yeah, but you won't get up early and go running, right? We say, I want to be able to resist sin like Jesus did. It's like, yeah, but you won't pray. Right? I mean, we could turn that into legalism and like God doesn't like you if you don't pray. That's not the point. The point is like, if you want to be able to resist these things in your life that have a hold of you, you got to change the habits. Yeah, make the bad habit unattractive, difficult, unsatisfying, and all those things that James Clear says. But then replace that negative thing with good things, right? Jesus tells a parable. He says, like, imagine somebody's got like all these demons in their heart. Imagine that there's all these demons living in this house, and the person says, like, I'm getting rid of the demons, and they sweep up the house and they make everything clean, and they kick all the bad spirits out of the house, but then they don't fill it up with anything good. And so what happens is that the spirit goes out and finds a whole gang of other spirits and says, hey, the house is still empty. Let's move back in. And now the house is worse off than it was originally, right? And you got to replace whatever negative thing you're trying to root up, pull up and weed out in your life. You got to replace that with something life-giving that's going to nurture this new person that you're wanting to be, right? So hopefully,
that's powerful.
Yeah, so hopefully the spiritual things, right? But then also, yeah, there's some very practical things that we can do. And I would say, like, on the practical level of making it difficult, making it unattractive, I mean, if it's helpful to you to get some sort of software there's software out there that you can download. There's free software that you can download onto your computer and onto your devices. That will make it more difficult to access pornography. I mean, you can still do it if you're motivated. You can still go find that stuff, but it makes it more difficult. There's even some that are rooted in accountability, where you type in the email addresses of 5 close friends that are going to help keep you accountable, and then they get a report every week of every website that you visited, right? That could be a powerful thing for your friends to be able to see what it is that you're spending your time doing with your devices. And I mean, so there's very practical stuff like that could be helpful. You could put, like, as a father, I could could do this. I mean, I haven't done this, but I could do this. I could put a picture of my wife and my daughter up in the corner of my computer screen, like on a post-it note. And I'm not even talking about like a wallpaper. I'm talking about a post-it note. So that as I'm looking at whatever's on my screen, I'm reminded of the love I have for my wife and my daughter, right? And then there's all sorts of motivations in that too. Like I want other people to look at my wife and my daughter and to honor them by how they look at them. I don't
Yeah.
want I don't want my daughter to grow up and be on other people's screens without her clothes on and doing things and creepy people all over the world watching it and taking pleasure from. Like I don't want that. I and 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 so I want everyone to see her and my wife the way that God sees them, right? And if I put that picture up there in the corner, then maybe the next time I'm tempted to click on a video and objectify somebody else's daughter, somebody else's sister,
Mm-hmm.
somebody else's neighbor or friend, maybe I'll see that picture of my family and be reminded, wait a minute, this person on this screen is a beloved creation made in the image of God, worthy of my respect and my honor. And I don't want to objectify and dehumanize them. And I don't want to objectify and dehumanize myself just for my own pleasure, because I want to live out a better story than that, right? There's those practical things. Like we could do those things and they really will help, right?
Mm-hmm.
Memorize scripture. That's the last practical thing. And I don't have this scripture memorized, but I want to read this. Paul wrote a letter to a friend named Titus, who was a partner in ministry, and he writes this in Titus chapter 2, verse 12. He says, "For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It, God's grace, it teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age." I think, if I were to memorize that verse and create a trigger that every time I'm tempted to lust, every time I'm tempted to watch pornography, if I created some sort of trigger that every time I feel that, it triggers Titus 2:12, right? That God's grace is intended to help me to say no to ungodliness and to live a self-controlled life for his purposes in the world, right? Those are simple things that anybody can do that could yield powerful results in our life, right? So
What would you say to, let's say I'm 17 years old and I'm like, Mark, I have an issue. I'm not married, but I have an issue. This is
yeah,
what I'm doing. What would you tell me?
yeah, I would say some similar things like get help,
Mm-hmm.
um, define what you want most in life, realize that what you're doing right now, which doesn't really seem to have any consequences,
Mm-hmm.
realize here's what the consequences are. All the stuff we've mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
consequences of
Yeah.
this you're creating expectations that then you're going to hold your future spouse to those standards, and it's going to
Yeah.
make them feel unloved and unworthy because you have unrealistic expectations. You are hurting someone. You're just hurting someone in the future, right? You're hurting yourself. You're objectifying this person on this screen. You're participating. You click on that video. Every click is monetized because of an ad, right? And so people are making money every time you click on that, and that money is going into people's pockets, people who are trafficking people, enslaving people, forcing people to do things, hurting people, abusing people, violating people, right? And so I think that's, if negative motivation works,
Yeah.
it's good negative motivation to be like, 17-year-old, do you want to be enslaving and trafficking other people and go down on the wrong side of history as a terrible person? I don't either. So like, stop it, right? Like we could make different choices, right?
But
So yeah,
my thing to you would be, was, oh, Mark, it's easy for you to say you're married. I'm 17. I'm not.
Right. Yeah. And I would say it it does, the habits that you create when you're not married, when you're married, those
Mm-hmm.
habits don't just disappear, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that I would say is just as a warning, like, the
Yeah.
old saying, wherever you go, there you are. Like
Yeah.
if you're living a life of watching pornography and looking at other people in lustful ways, and then you find the person you want to marry and you marry them, like you're not just going to instantaneously change overnight and only just love this person. You're still the person who cultivated all those habits, right?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and I would say, the statement of, well, I'm not married, so I'm not cheating on anyone. And so who does it really hurt? And I would say it still hurts all the other people
Yeah.
involved in the equation, right? Hurts the people who are on the video, hurts you, hurts your future spouse. Um,
So
and here's the
it's
thing
just
too, like I would love to tell a 17-year-old, like, hey, instead of watching porn, you could be out there changing the world. Like you can literally be saving people's lives, right? I mean, like 17-year-olds can enlist, right? And I'm not saying military service is for everyone. And, it's a completely different episode to talk about Christian perspective on the
yeah.
military or whatever. But it's like, go fight bad guys. Like, like turn off the screen, quit pleasuring yourself. I mean, not to get too graphic here, get your hand
Yeah.
out of your pants and go do something that matters in the world, right? Like
Yeah.
that's another thing that I would say is like, what a waste. What a waste of
Yeah.
time. What a waste of, and again, I'm not saying there's no appeal. I get it. I get the appeal. I get the temptation.
Yeah.
I understand. Um, but like, go live a life that matters. There's
Yeah.
there's a somebody called this the deathbed prayer. Imagine you're on your deathbed and you're reflecting back on your life, and imagine that you're able to reflect back on your life with joy. I lived a life that mattered. I wasn't perfect, but I lived a life that mattered, right? And so then this deathbed prayer is basically, you can pray that prayer in the present and be like, am I living that kind of life right now? Right. And so that's what I would say to somebody who's wrapped up in porn or whatever, or other kind of addictions. Like,
Mm.
pray that deathbed prayer, like not out of fear, but just like, is this the story you really want to be living out? Right. Think
Yeah.
of the most compelling stories out there, like the great stories, right? I'm going to go all Lord of the Rings now, right? The great stories are ones where people fought for something that mattered. They overcame great adversity. They were brave and courageous, right? A guy who sits in his room and watches videos all day, that's not a compelling story. Like, right? So live out a better story. That's what I would encourage anybody, not just young
Yeah.
people, but anybody to do. So,
Yeah. Final question for you, Mark. If
right.
you were to die tomorrow, what would you like to be remembered for?
Oh man. Um, I think I would probably answer that if I was going to talk a long time on that, I would answer with nuances for each person. Like obviously, I would want my wife and my kids to remember me as a great husband and dad, loving. But I think overall, yeah, um, and I know this sounds so churchy. I just like, if I could remove all pretense or pridefulness from this and just really say it authentically and mean it, um, I would want people to say he was like Jesus. He was kind. He was loving. Um, he got mad at and chastised unjust religious people who were prideful, right? Like, he defended the people who were beat down by life, and He helped. He saw people's needs and responded with compassion and action, not just thoughts and prayers, but righteous action. Like those are all things that are true of Jesus. And my hope would be that if I died tomorrow and I'm being memorialized or whatever, they're doing the funeral, that people would get up and tell those kinds of stories. And not because I am those things. But that's who I hope to become by God's grace. So
Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you so much, Mark.
yeah. Thank you, Andy. This is fun.